You know, we live in a culture that equates silence with weakness. If you're not speaking up, you must be scared. If you're not explaining yourself, you must be guilty. If you're not retaliating, then surely you've lost. But what if I told you that silence, real, grounded, conscious silence, is one of the most powerful psychological tools available to you, especially in the face of narcissistic manipulation? See, silence isn't the absence of response, it's the presence of restraint. It's not avoidance, it's assertion. It's you reclaiming the frame, stepping out of the game and forcing your opponent to sit alone in the chaos they created. The narcissist thrives on engagement. That's a fundamental psychological truth. They provoke to pull you in. They wound to extract a reaction. Every emotional spike you give them, rage, confusion, heartbreak, it feeds them. It reaffirms their sense of control. So what happens when you give them nothing? When you meet their bait with stillness, when you stare at the drama they ignite and refuse to pick up the script, what happens is profound. It's a collapse, not a confrontation. It's not fireworks, it's implosion. Your silence becomes a void they can't fill. And into that void rushes everything they've been trying to avoid. Self-loathing, insecurity, a hollow sense of identity. They were counting on your participation to distract themselves from their own emptiness, and suddenly they're left alone with it. That's when regret surfaces. That's when the panic begins. Not because they miss you in the sentimental sense, but because they've lost control over the reflection of themselves they used you to maintain. Let's go deeper. Silence isn't just about what you withhold from them. It's about what you preserve for yourself. It's the boundary you draw between your integrity and their dysfunction, and that boundary, once enforced by silence, sends an unmistakable signal. I am no longer available to serve your delusion. That's terrifying for a narcissist, because your willingness to engage was the leash they held. Once you stop pulling, the illusion snaps. And there's something else, something critical that's often missed. Silence is not about running away. It's not about retreat, it's about elevation. It's the mark of someone who no longer needs to prove their worth in a broken system. You're not falling silent because you're afraid. You're falling silent because you've outgrown the conversation entirely. That distinction matters, because when silence comes from strength, it radiates power. It becomes its own form of speech, more commanding than any argument, more honest than any defense. Now, does this mean you should never speak? No, but it means you should never speak just to be heard by someone who has no intention of listening. That's where your power leaks. That's where your identity gets twisted into knots, when you keep trying to explain your value to someone who has already decided to deny it. That's why silence becomes the higher road. Not because it's easier, but because it demands more discipline. It requires self-acknowledge. It asks you to sit with your own discomfort, your own ego, your own desire to set the record straight. And in that crucible, you refine yourself. Think of it this way. Silence is a mirror you hold up to the narcissist, and they hate mirrors, because when they're not controlling the reflection, what they see is unbearable. They see someone grasping for power they don't truly have. They see someone exposed, and if you've ever watched a narcissist unravel in the face of no contact or stone-cold silence, you've seen the truth of this firsthand. The rage, the desperation, the frantic attempts to provoke again, to pull you back in. That's not love. That's withdrawal. It's the addict losing access to the substance. You've become their silence. And that silence is echoing louder than any words you could have said. It's telling them everything. It's telling them that their games no longer work, that their manipulation failed, that their importance in your life has been demoted from central to irrelevant. And that's not a blow to their heart. It's a blow to their ego. It's existential. Because the narcissist survives by believing they're irreplaceable. Your silence proves they're not. But perhaps the most important reason silence is powerful is because it gives you space to heal. It recenters your nervous system. It takes the emotional IV out of the chaos. It stops the bleeding. When you go silent, you stop performing, you stop trying to win a rigged game. And in that quiet, you begin to hear yourself again. You begin to think clearly, act deliberately, rebuild your self-worth, not as something they give you, but as something that belongs to you. So don't confuse silence with surrender. Don't let the world convince you that power only comes through noise or explanation or retaliation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say absolutely nothing and mean it. No closure, no last word, no emotional proof, because when you say nothing from a place of absolute self-possession, you say everything. And that right there is when the narcissist starts to regret everything. You know, people often underestimate the psychological potency of non-reaction. And I don't mean apathy, I mean the deeply conscious decision not to react, to refrain from feeding into provocation, especially when dealing with narcissists. See, narcissists operate within a very rigid psychological framework. It's fragile, even though it presents itself as domineering or impenetrable. Their identity is propped up by illusion, delusions of superiority, entitlement, infallibility. And that illusion is maintained through a constant cycle of projection, manipulation, and reaction harvesting. They poke, they prod, they provoke, and every time you flinch, explain, rage, cry, defend, you give them evidence that they still matter in your world, that their actions work, that they can disturb your peace and rearrange your internal state. So when you break that pattern, when you remain internally anchored, unshaken, and silent, you're not just choosing dignity, you're confronting the narcissist with the one thing they cannot metabolize, their own irrelevance. Now let's be clear, this isn't easy. It takes immense psychological strength to choose presence over reaction, because when someone wounds you, especially someone close to you, your nervous system screams for resolution. You want justice. You want acknowledgement. You want to shout the truth into their delusion and force them to see it. But here's the problem. Narcissists aren't interested in truth. They're interested in control. And when you try to argue your truth with someone who treats facts like suggestions, you're playing chess with a pigeon. They'll knock over the pieces, crap on the board, and fly away, pretending they won. And yet, here's the paradox. They know exactly what they're doing. On some level, they know their power comes from your emotional instability, from keeping you off balance. That's how they stay dominant in the relationship, not through logic, not through actual virtue, but through destabilization. So when you hold your ground, when you refuse to rise to the bait, you break the only system they know how to operate within. You render their tactics inert, and that to a narcissist is intolerable. Now, psychologically, what you're doing here is shifting from a reactive posture to a sovereign one. You're no longer allowing the narcissist to dictate the tempo of your inner life. You're reclaiming authorship over your emotional responses. That's critical, because once you do that, you're no longer being controlled. You're choosing, and choice is power. You're choosing not to be baited. You're choosing not to hand over your emotional energy like a donation to someone who weaponizes it against you. But let's go deeper, because this isn't just about winning a psychological game. This is about identity, about values, about the kind of person you decide to be in the face of emotional chaos. And here's the real key. Your non-reaction isn't passive. It's active self-governance. It's discipline. It's the conscious elevation of your character above their dysfunction. You're saying, I refuse to become what you're trying to provoke out of me. That's a moral decision. It's philosophical. It's you declaring, my peace is not negotiable. There's an ancient idea in Stoic philosophy. Epictetus talked about it. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And it holds up. The narcissist wants you to believe that your emotional world is under their jurisdiction, but it isn't. They might fire the shot, but you decide whether it lands. You decide whether to internalize it. You decide whether to respond from a wounded ego or from grounded wisdom. And when you respond from wisdom, when you offer silence instead of escalation, stillness instead of chaos, the narcissist begins to panic. Why? Because they can't find the lever. They keep pulling and nothing moves. Their power wasn't in themselves. It was in your reaction. And now you've removed the fuel. They can't light the fire anymore because you're not handing them the matches. That is the essence of winning without fighting. It's psychological Aikido. You redirect the energy. You let their chaos collapse under its own weight. You let them reveal their dysfunction while you remain composed, watching, unmoved. And that silence, that non-reaction, it becomes a mirror. And that mirror is mercy, because suddenly they see themselves clearly, and it's not a pretty picture. All the things they accused you of doing, That's them. All the chaos, all the instability, all the guilt tripping and blame shifting, that's their reflection staring back. So your silence isn't cruelty, it's clarity. It's a boundary. It's you saying, I know who I am. I know what I won't tolerate, and I don't need to scream to prove it. And if you want to leave a lasting impression on a narcissist, one that echoes louder than any argument, then walk away without a sound. Let them sit in the silence of their own dysfunction while you rise into the freedom of your own emotional sovereignty. Because silence, when it comes from strength, doesn't whisper, it roars. And that roar, that's what makes them regret everything. Hello, you've reached Play AI Support. I see you're interested in our cutting-edge voice synthesis technology. Let's explore how we can elevate your project to the next level. Here's the truth we don't talk about nearly enough. When a super empath finally realizes that they don't need to explain themselves, they become untouchable. See, narcissists thrive on the endless loop of defense and justification. They corner you with accusations, twist your words, distort your intentions, and then sit back and feed on your desperate attempts to clarify, to prove that your heart was good, that your actions were pure. But what they're really after isn't clarity, it's control. And every explanation you offer is just another thread they pull to unravel your sense of self. Now, this is important. Empaths, especially those with a deep moral compass, are wired to care about fairness. They're oriented toward harmony. They want things to be understood, resolved, healed. So when a narcissist warps reality, the empath instinctively rushes in to fix it, to make it right. But in doing so, they step into the narcissist trap. Because the narcissist doesn't want resolution, they want dominion. And the more you talk, the deeper you sink into their terrain. But something fascinating happens when the empath matures, when they cross the threshold from reactive compassion to grounded discernment. They start to understand that not everyone is owed an explanation. Not everyone is ready to hear the truth. And more importantly, some people actively weaponize your truth against you. At that point, silence becomes not only a boundary, but a form of self-respect. This isn't avoidance, it's strategy, it's wisdom, it's a refusal to waste energy explaining the sun to people committed to calling it a flashlight. Because what's the point of truth in a space where truth is mocked? What's the point of defending your intentions to someone who already decided you're the villain before you opened your mouth? That's not a conversation, that's a performance. And the empath finally says, I'm done auditioning. Psychologically, this shift is monumental because the moment you stop justifying yourself, you disrupt the narcissist's entire framework. Their power begins to disintegrate. Why? Because it was never rooted in strength. It was rooted in your doubt, in your willingness to keep explaining, in your fear of being misunderstood. So when that fear dissolves, so does their grip. This is what I mean by you become untouchable. Not because you grow cold or uncaring, but because you stop trying to convince people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop flailing in the emotional quicksand of a narcissist narrative, and you realize something incredibly liberating. Your peace doesn't require their permission. Let's be even more precise. Your identity, your integrity, your values, they don't live in someone else's perception. They live in your behavior and your patterns and your choices. That's where your truth is. So when you embody that truth and no longer feel the compulsion to announce or defend it, you become a fortress. Not impenetrable in a hardened way, but immovable in a principled way. Now, if you've ever stopped explaining yourself to a narcissist, you've probably seen what comes next. Rage, accusations, guilt trips. They'll say you're hiding something, being manipulative, being cold. They'll escalate, hoping to provoke a reaction that gets the loop running again. Why? Because your silence is terrifying to them. It means you've left their psychological orbit. It means you're now playing a game they can't win, one where your validation doesn't come from them anymore. And make no mistake, the narcissist needs your energy. They don't exist in isolation. They require someone to mirror back the grandiose fantasy, or better yet, someone to collapse under the weight of it so they can feel superior. But the moment you stop playing that role, The moment you choose stillness over reaction, conviction over explanation, you become the mirror, and what they see in that mirror is the truth they've spent their whole life avoiding. So in many ways, when you stop explaining yourself, you're not just protecting your peace, you're forcing accountability. You're making them sit in the consequences of their own distortions without giving them a script to twist. And that space, that silence, it's where their regrets begin to fester. Because regret doesn't grow in noise, it grows in silence. When the empath stops engaging, stops spinning in circles trying to be understood, the narcissist is left alone with their own echo chamber. And no matter how loud their justifications get, there's no one left to argue with, no one left to blame. Just them and the truth they've tried to bury. So if you're someone who spent too long explaining yourself, trying to earn empathy from the emotionally bankrupt, I want you to consider this. Maybe your silence isn't retreat. Maybe it's evolution. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful thing you'll ever say is nothing at all. Because when you no longer need to explain who you are, you've finally become it. Let's talk about something that most people instinctively understand, but rarely articulate with clarity. How the most devastating blow you can deliver to a narcissist is not through retaliation, or confrontation, or even public exposure. It's through your emotional indifference, your neutrality, that cold, clean silence that doesn't scream, doesn't plead, doesn't flinch, just exists. Stoic, unmoved. And for a narcissist, it is intolerable. Why? Because their psychological infrastructure is built on the assumption that they control how you feel. If they can't trigger you, they can't manipulate you. And if they can't manipulate you, they can't feed on you. Now, here's the real tragedy of narcissism. It's parasitic by nature. It needs your emotional highs and lows to survive. It needs your confusion, your affection, your outrage. These are the lifelines. Because in the narcissist's world, chaos isn't a byproduct, it's a tool. So when you respond with emotional neutrality, what you're really doing is cutting the cord to that dependency. You're stepping outside their game board, and they have no moves left. You see, most people assume that silence is weakness, that passivity equals submission. But that's not what I'm talking about here. This isn't passive. This is active withdrawal of supply. It is intentional, conscious, a psychological choice grounded in profound inner clarity. I don't need to participate in this delusion anymore. That choice, made quietly but with resolve, is what shakes the narcissist at their core. Because now you're not reacting, you're not defending, you're not explaining, you're not trying to win, you're simply not playing. And here's where things get deeper. Psychologically, emotional neutrality at its highest level is a kind of spiritual boundary. It's a declaration that your internal state is no longer up for auction. It says, my peace is not a pawn on your chessboard. That kind of stillness isn't born from apathy. It's born from exhaustion turned into wisdom. You tried speaking, you tried compassion, you tried empathy, and you finally saw that none of it worked. Not because you lacked skill or heart, but because the person in front of you lacked the will to meet you honestly. So you stopped. And when you stop, really stop, something profound happens. The narcissist is confronted with the silence of their own irrelevance. Not because you said they didn't matter, but because you no longer needed to prove that you do. That's the difference. Let me give you an analogy to ground this. Think of the narcissist as a storm, raging, demanding recognition. They need your fear to prove they exist. They need your resistance to feel powerful. But when you become the mountain, silent, grounded, immovable, they crash against you and fall apart. Not because you fought them, but because you refuse to collapse. This is the power of indifference. It's not icy. It's not cruel. It's simply done. And nothing drives a narcissist more insane than someone who's just done. Because in their mind, there's always supposed to be one more round, one more argument, one more opportunity to draw blood. They bait and they bait and they bait. And when nothing comes back, when the line goes slack, they panic. They spiral, because without your emotional reactivity, they lose the mirror that reflects their imagined superiority. But let's take this even further. Emotional neutrality isn't just a defense. It's a kind of moral clarity. It says, I no longer need you to change for me to be okay. That is the most powerful place a person can operate from. You transcend the drama. And when you do, the narcissist is left in a prison of their own design, pacing in circles, furious that the door they used to slam shut behind you is now swinging open and you're walking away. You don't need to slam the door. You don't need to announce your exit. You just stop participating. And that is the punishment. Not revenge, not exposure, just the loss of access. And let's not underestimate how devastating that is to a narcissist. Because when you remove emotional access, you're not just taking your words, you're taking the reflection of importance they depended on to stabilize their ego. And when that reflection vanishes, they're forced to face what they've spent their entire life avoiding, the hollow space within themselves. Now, does this path require discipline? Absolutely, because the instinct to defend yourself, to yell, to explain, to make them see is powerful. But that instinct is exactly what they count on. It's bait. And every time you rise to it, you reinforce the illusion that they're worth the emotional effort. But when you stay still, when you refuse to be moved, not out of fear, but out of clarity, that's when the game ends. So I'll leave you with this. You don't need to prove the storm is real. You just need to become the mountain. When you decide to step out of the narcissist game entirely, when you make that profound and deliberate shift into silence, not just outer silence, but inner detachment, you begin to see something truly remarkable unfold. The dynamic that once seemed all-powerful begins to unravel. The narcissist, who once appeared to hold all the strings, suddenly looks small, almost desperate, and you realize it was never power they had. It was access to your attention, to your emotions, to your identity. And when that access is gone, the illusion of control crumbles. Let's be clear about what's happening here. This isn't about ghosting or disappearing as some manipulative counter tactic. No, that's still reactive. That still centers them. What we're talking about is transcendence. A psychological and emotional transcendence that no longer treats the narcissist as the axis around which your internal life rotates. And that transformation, although silent, is deeply visible. Not in what you say, but in what you no longer respond to. People often underestimate how loud silence can be when it's coming from a place of grounded self-possession. The narcissist can feel it. They know something has shifted. You're not flinching anymore. You're not dancing to the emotional bait they throw at your feet. You're not offering your soul on the altar of their approval. You're simply there, quiet, unshaken, sovereign. And nothing unsettles a manipulator more than realizing their manipulation is no longer working. And it's not just unsettling, it's infuriating. Because narcissists feed on predictability. They count on you reacting the same way every time they push the same button. So when you stop reacting, you break the cycle. You remove the pattern. You disarm the script. They become actors with no stage. And here's the beautiful irony. The more you withdraw from the performance, the more they fall apart trying to sustain it. But there's something else going on here beneath the surface, and it's essential to grasp this. When you become truly silent in the psychological sense, when your inner world no longer trembles under their shadow, you force them to confront the one thing they've spent their whole life running from. Themselves. See, as long as they could project their dysfunction onto you, blame you, confuse you, twist your words, they never had to face the abyss inside. But when your presence no longer absorbs that projection, the mirror turns back on them. And that's terrifying. Now, this doesn't mean they'll suddenly change or find enlightenment. More often than not, they won't. But that's not the point. Your healing, your clarity, your detachment. That's where the victory lies, not in their regret, not in their awakening, but in your freedom. Your silence is not a weapon, it's a boundary, a sacred line drawn not in anger, but in self-respect. You're not playing silent to manipulate. You're silent because you have nothing left to prove. And in that state, you gain something extraordinary. Emotional leverage, not over them, but over your own internal landscape. You realize that your emotions are no longer involuntary reactions triggered by someone else's pathology. They are yours, chosen, not coerced. And once you reclaim that, you begin to move differently, speak differently, choose differently. You're no longer reacting to their chaos, you're building your own order. This is the stage where real transformation happens. Because now, You're not just avoiding the narcissist, you're rebuilding yourself without them. You start tending to the damage they left, the self-doubt, the hypervigilance, the tendency to second-guess your intuition, and you start to see, with startling clarity, just how much of yourself was once entangled in their dysfunction. But here's the redemptive part. You also begin to see how much of yourself survived. And in that survival is the seed of a deeper truth, that your power was never lost, it was only misdirected. You weren't weak for being vulnerable. You were strong for having the capacity to care. You weren't broken for staying too long. You were loyal, hopeful, deeply human. But now you know better, and knowing better allows you to choose better. This is why your silence echoes, not because it's empty, but because it's full of everything you finally remembered about yourself, your dignity, your worth, your wholeness. And when a narcissist feels that in you, feels that they no longer have access to distort or diminish any of it, it creates an unbridgeable gap. They might try to provoke, to re-engage, to pull you back into the dynamic, but they'll be shouting across a canyon you no longer intend to cross. So, don't underestimate what your stillness communicates. It says, I have nothing to take from you and nothing to give you. You are not a factor in the architecture of my peace. That's what breaks the spell. Not revenge, not exposure, but quiet, relentless inner alignment. And so, I'll leave you with this. You don't need to speak to be heard. You just need to be unshakably done. When you walk away in silence, not out of spite, not out of fear, but out of clarity, something happens that narcissists never quite prepare for. You disrupt the entire ecosystem of control they've worked so hard to cultivate. Because here's the truth. Narcissists are not strong. They are fragile, masquerading as powerful. They don't thrive on strength. They survive on supply. That is, your attention, your confusion, your emotional volatility. That's the fuel. And when you take that away with full awareness, with no drama, no begging, no declarations, just a quiet, firm exit, you begin the process of their psychological unraveling. See, what breaks the narcissist is not confrontation. It's not the screaming match. It's not the carefully worded email or the therapy-informed boundary statement. All of those still signal that you're in the game. You're still energetically engaged. You still care about how they see you, what they think, whether they understand. And as long as they know that, deep down, they can keep pulling strings. But when you walk away and mean it, when you stop trying to prove the truth, when you let them misunderstand you and feel nothing about it, that's when the dynamic dies. That kind of exit requires a deeper transformation within you. It's not just about cutting off contact, it's about cutting off access. And that's not the same thing. You can block someone's number, change your address, even move across the world. But if they still live in your mind, if their voice still shapes your self-perception, you're not free. Not yet. The real exit is internal. It's a reorientation of value. You stop seeing their approval as currency. You stop seeing their validation as reward. You stop seeing their manipulation as anything more than the flailing of someone who never learned how to love without control. This kind of silence is different. It's not passive. It's not the silence of repression or avoidance. It's the silence of someone who has nothing left to explain. It's the stillness of someone who has come to terms with the brutal simplicity of truth, that some people are not capable of seeing you clearly, and it is not your job to make them. That is what narcissists hate most. Not being yelled at, but being irrelevant. Now, I want to be clear, this doesn't mean you don't grieve. You do. In fact, that silence gives you space to finally grieve, not the loss of the narcissist, but the loss of the fantasy you held on to, the version of them that never existed, the hope that maybe if you just loved hard enough, explained clearly enough, stayed loyal long enough, they'd change. That grief is real, and it's painful, but it's also clean. It's not the contaminated pain of being gaslit or demeaned. It's the sacred pain of waking up. And what do you wake up into? Power. Not the flashy kind, not dominance, but sovereignty. You start to reclaim your internal authority. You begin to see that the clarity you were begging them to give you about yourself, about the relationship, you already had it. It was just buried under all the noise. And the silence you've stepped into gives you a chance to listen to it again, to rebuild the relationship you have with yourself. Because that's what they tried to erode, wasn't it? Your trust in your own perception, your ability to know what's true and act accordingly. Rebuilding that is not glamorous, it's slow, it's sometimes boring, but it is the most profound act of rebellion. Because narcissists don't just want to hurt you, they want you to doubt your reality. They want you to be dependent on their version of things. So when you quietly, consistently choose your own truth, your own vision, your own rhythm, you're doing something revolutionary. You're rewriting the script. And that's why this kind of silence is so powerful. Because it doesn't scream, "I'm over you." It shows it. It manifests in how you carry yourself, in the people you now attract, in the peace that begins to define your days. It's in the laughter that returns, unforced, in the decisions that no longer involve second guessing, in the simple joy of being present without scanning the room for signs of approval or danger. What they hate most isn't that you're gone. It's that you're thriving, that you didn't just leave, you healed. You didn't just escape, you grew. You didn't just survive, you transcended. That kind of transformation renders them powerless. Not because you punished them, but because you no longer participate in the game at all. So let them wonder, let them talk, let them project. Your silence is not absence, it's elevation. And you don't have to explain that to anyone, because the loudest message you will ever send to someone who tried to break you is this: I didn't just walk away. I found myself on the other side.